When the Burmese military government used violence to crack down on pro-democracy demonstrators last September, U.S. economic sanctions on the country had already been in place for 10 years. In February, the United States imposed new sanctions, narrowly targeting businesses and individuals linked to Burma's military rulers. White House Press Secretary Dana Perino.
We do know that sanctions can have an impact, and they help curtail economic activity and can further isolate the junta, which is part of getting them to recognize that they need to open up.
Economic sanctions have been used by the international community for decades to pressure countries to change what is seen as bad behavior. Sometimes they're considered a success. In South Africa, international sanctions were widely credited with helping to end apartheid. Many times they fail. U.S. sanctions on the Cuban government have been in place for more than 40 years, but did nothing to weaken former ruler Fidel Castro's grip on power. Critics argue that sanctions hurt ordinary civilians more than the leaders who are targeted. Ted Galen Carpenter is head of foreign policy and defense studies at the Cato Institute, a libertarian research group in Washington. He says that in Iraq, United Nations sanctions caused widespread humanitarian suffering.
There are various estimates of how much the sanctions against Iraq in the 1990s and up to the invasion and occupation of the country in 2003 injured the children of that country, how much it increased infant and young child mortality rates. The estimates range anywhere from 100,000 needless deaths to 500,000. But however many, it was an enormous total of purely innocent people.
Some foreign policy experts say it was the failure of those Iraqi sanctions that prompted the United States to change the way it seeks to pressure what it considers belligerent governments. Michael Jacobson is a former U.S. Treasury Department official, now with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He says in recent years, the U.S. has adopted what he calls smart sanctions, targeted financial measures against individuals engaging in perceived bad behavior. Take Iran. In 1995, the United States initiated a ban on most trade by U.S. businesses there. But since 2005, the Treasury Department has designated individual Iranian officials and companies as proliferators of weapons of mass destruction. Jacobson argues that new measures such as freezing assets of individuals and imposing travel restrictions are likely to prove more effective than the broad sanctions of the past.
When you're saying something like a U.S. business cannot do business with any Iranian entity, I think that sends a very different message than a U.S. business cannot do business with this specific entity that's involved in terrorism, that's involved in WMD proliferation.
So far, Iran has failed to abandon its uranium enrichment program. Some trade analysts say that's because Iran's leading role in energy production makes it difficult for its rulers to be pressured. Gary Huffbauer is a sanctions expert at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington. He says that no matter how they are used, sanctions generally succeed in achieving their foreign policy goals only about one-third of the time.
Diplomacy is not like a football game. Rarely do you have a clear win and a clear loss. Often it's kind of in the gray intermediates, and this is one of those tools of diplomacy which tends to be in the gray intermediates.
Huffbauer argues that sanctions are most effective when their goals are modest, such as freeing political prisoners rather than attempting to change the government. Leta Hong Fincher, VOA News.